The morning of April 9, 1942 broke over the Bataan Peninsula with the same merciless heat that had tormented American and Filipino defenders for 93 days. Major General Edward P. King Jr. stood at his command post, gazing at what remained of his army. Behind him stretched 15 miles of jungle and mountain, the final defensive line of a force that had defied Japanese expectations for 3 months. Before him lay an impossible decision that would doom 76,000 men to one of history's most notorious war crimes. King commanded an army in name only. Of the original force, fewer than half could walk 100 yards without collapsing. 70% suffered from malaria. Dysentery had turned strong soldiers into skeletal shadows. Men weighed 30% less than they had in January. Their faces were hollow masks stretched over bone. Their eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of those who had witnessed too much death and expected their own momentarily. The supplies had run out weeks ago. Ammunition existed in quantities measured by individual bullets rather than crates. No air support remained. The handful of P-40 fighters that had defended the Philippines were destroyed on the ground in December or shot from the sky by superior Japanese Zeros. The Navy had retreated south after Pearl Harbor crippled the Pacific Fleet. No reinforcements would arrive. General Douglas MacArthur had evacuated to Australia on March 11 with the promise, "I shall return." But that return would not come in time to save the men trapped on Bataan. The roots of this catastrophe stretched back to July 1941, when MacArthur assumed command of United States forces in the Far East. The existing War Plan Orange III had anticipated exactly this scenario, a fighting withdrawal to Bataan Peninsula to hold Manila Bay until the Navy could mount a relief expedition. The plan specified stockpiling supplies for 43,000 men for 6 months on Bataan. But MacArthur had rejected War Plan Orange III as defeatist. He preferred an aggressive beach defense strategy covering the entire Philippine archipelago with the newly mobilized Philippine Army. When the Japanese invaded on December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, MacArthur's beach defense collapsed within days. On December 23, 1941, he reverted to War Plan Orange III and ordered the retreat to Bataan. But the critical supply prepositioning had been canceled months earlier. The 76,000 troops who withdrew to Bataan found supplies for only 43,000 men for 2 months instead of 6. Starvation became inevitable. The Battle of Bataan had raged since January 7, 1942. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa's Japanese 14th Army expected victory by mid-February. Instead, they encountered ferocious resistance along successive defensive lines. The WWII line held from January 7 through 25. When Japanese forces attempted amphibious landings behind American lines in the Battle of the Points, defenders annihilated the landing parties. The Orion-Bagak line held through February and March. But hunger accomplished what Japanese artillery could not. On January 1, 1942, half rations became mandatory. By February, quarter rations, approximately 1,000 calories daily when combat soldiers require 3,500. Soldiers supplemented their diet with anything that moved: iguanas, monkeys, snakes, wild pigs, even cavalry horses and mules. The 26th Cavalry Regiment, which had conducted the last mounted cavalry charge in United States Army history in January 1942, butchered their beloved horses in February and served them as rations.
Disease swept through the weakened ranks. Malaria, transmitted by clouds of mosquitoes breeding in jungle pools, infected 7 of every 10 soldiers. Without quinine, the fever returned in waves, shaking chills followed by burning skin, hallucinations, and delirium. Dysentery turned the jungle trails into paths of misery as men lost control of their bowels. Dengue fever, beriberi from vitamin deficiency, hookworm, and scrub typhus added to the medical nightmare. The field hospitals overflowed with casualties who had never been wounded by enemy fire. By April, the army existed in name only. Hospital Tunnel No. 1 on Corregidor held 1,000 patients in a space designed for 500. General Hospital No. 2 on Bataan treated patients lying in the mud because no beds remained. Doctors performed surgery without anesthesia. Bandages were washed and reused until they disintegrated. The stench of gangrene, dysentery, and death filled the humid air. On April 3, 1942, the Japanese launched their final offensive. 100 aircraft blackened the sky. 300 artillery pieces, the heaviest concentration of the Pacific War thus far, hammered the American and Filipino positions. Mount Samat, the key defensive strongpoint, fell within days. The defensive line shattered. Japanese forces poured through gaps, threatening to encircle the entire defensive force. King faced his impossible choice. Orders from MacArthur in Australia and Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright on Corregidor Fortress forbade surrender. But King commanded men too weak to fight, with ammunition exhausted, no possibility of relief, and Japanese forces closing from 3 directions. Continued resistance meant annihilation. Surrender might save lives, or so King desperately hoped. At 11 a.m. on April 9, 1942, King met Japanese officers near Balanga, Bataan Province. The American general cut an incongruous figure. His uniform still pressed despite 3 months of jungle warfare. His bearing erect despite the defeat. The Japanese officers, flush with victory, showed little interest in pleasantries. At 12:30 p.m., King performed the most painful duty of his military career. He handed his pistol to Colonel Moto Nakayama. His saber remained in Manila. The gesture signified unconditional surrender. King spoke carefully, choosing words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I am surrendering the Bataan forces." He insisted his men had fought with honor until rendered combat ineffective by starvation and disease. The Japanese showed no sympathy. To them, surrender represented the ultimate dishonor. The Senjin-kun Field Service Code issued in January 1941 explicitly forbade Japanese soldiers from retreating or surrendering under any circumstances. Death was preferable to captivity. These Americans and Filipinos who chose surrender over suicide earned only contempt. King returned to his staff and issued final instructions. "You men remember this. You did not surrender. You had no alternative but to obey my order." He accepted sole responsibility, attempting to shield his subordinates from the shame he knew would follow. It was a noble gesture, but it would not save them from what came next. The forces surrendered included approximately 12,000 Americans and 66,000 Filipinos, though exact numbers remain disputed because chaos reigned during the final days. Among them were the Philippine Division with its 31st Infantry Regiment, the 26th Cavalry Regiment, Philippine Scouts, the 200th and 515th Coast Artillery, anti-aircraft regiments from the New Mexico National Guard, the 192nd and 194th Tank Battalions, 10 Filipino Army divisions, and countless support units. In addition to military personnel, approximately 38,000 Filipino civilians had fled into the American defensive zone seeking protection. They, too, would become prisoners, though the Japanese had not planned for them at all.
Lieutenant General Hama had expected to capture perhaps 25,000 prisoners, combat troops only, relatively healthy. His logistics officers planned for that number. They received more than 3 times what they expected. Every calculation, every plan, every assumption would prove catastrophically wrong.
And 76,000 men were about to pay the price for Japanese miscalculation and deliberate cruelty in equal measure. As the sun set on April 9, 1942, American and Filipino soldiers sat in surrender assembly areas uncertain what fate awaited them. Some felt relief that the fighting had ended. Others experienced shame at having surrendered. Most were simply too exhausted and sick to feel anything beyond the gnawing hunger that had consumed them for months. None imagined the horror that would begin the next morning when the march started from Mariveles. The Bataan Death March, one of World War II's most notorious war crimes, was about to begin. The march began on April 10, 1942, from two primary starting points. The southern group departed from Mariveles at the tip of the Bataan Peninsula, where the 0-kilometer marker still stands today. The western group left from Saisan Point near Bagak on April 11th, converging with the main column at Pilar. From these scattered assembly points, approximately 76,000 prisoners began a 65-mile journey that would kill between 7,000 and 18,000 men before reaching San Fernando, Pampanga. Before the march properly began, Japanese guards conducted shakedowns, ordering all prisoners to surrender personal possessions. Rings, watches, wallets, photographs of loved ones, religious medals, everything went into piles that guards sorted through, keeping what they wanted and destroying the rest. Anyone found with Japanese money or souvenirs from dead Japanese soldiers faced immediate execution. Survivor Bert Bank witnessed a guard discover a ring on a prisoner's finger. The ring wouldn't come off the swollen finger. The guard didn't wait. He drew a machete and severed the man's wrist, letting him bleed out in the dirt while retrieving the ring. Bank watched another prisoner get a bayonet thrust through his stomach for possessing a Japanese coin. The screaming man twisted on the blade for several minutes before dying. These were not isolated incidents, but a pattern that would repeat thousands of times over the next week. The first miles revealed the Japanese had made no preparations whatsoever for the prisoner movement. No trucks waited to transport the sick. No food supplies had been positioned along the route. No water stations existed. No medical care would be provided. The prisoners would walk, if you could call their stumbling, staggering progress walking, or they would die. The April heat slammed into the column like a physical force. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The tropical sun beat down from a cloudless sky with murderous intensity. The prisoners, already weakened by 3 months of starvation, felt the heat drain what little strength remained. Within the first mile, men began collapsing. The Japanese response to anyone who fell established the pattern for the entire march. Guards would kick the fallen man and shout, "Speedo, speedo," their pidgin English for speed up or hurry. If the man couldn't rise immediately, a bayonet or bullet ended his life. No mercy, no delay, no hesitation. The column kept moving. The body remained where it fell. The guards organized prisoners into groups of approximately 100 men with 4 Japanese soldiers per group. This low guard-to-prisoner ratio reflected Japanese assumptions about compliant captives. They never imagined sick, starving men might become desperate. The guards compensated for their small numbers with ruthless violence. Any hint of defiance, any failure to immediately obey, any perceived disrespect brought swift punishment: beating, bayoneting, or shooting. Lester Tenney, a tank commander with the 19th 92nd Tank Battalion, marched with the early groups from Mariveles. His unit had fought with distinction during the defense, destroying multiple Japanese tanks in the January fighting before their ammunition ran out. Now Tenney trudged north with hundreds of other tankers who had become infantrymen by necessity, then prisoners by circumstance. Tenney described the first day. We had no food or water. The temperature was about 106, 108 degrees. We were all sick. We all had malaria, dysentery. We had gunshot wounds, bayonet wounds. The sun was beating down and there was no relief. If you stopped walking, you died. If you had to defecate, you died. If you had a malaria attack, you died. It made no difference what it was. Either they cut your head off, they shot you, or they bayoneted you. The first major atrocity occurred near the Pilar-Bagak Road at the Pantingan River on April 12, 1942. Japanese forces separated 350 to 400 Filipino officers and NCOs from the 91st, 71st, and 51st Philippine Army Divisions. Japanese Brigadier General Akira Nara of the 65th Brigade arrived by automobile before the executions began. His presence indicated this was not the random violence of individual guards, but organized mass murder sanctioned at high levels. The Filipino soldiers were tied with telephone wire, hands behind backs, 3 men to a wire. Guards formed them into 3 groups. What followed was systematic slaughter. Guards used rifles, bayonets, swords, and rifle butts. Some victims were shot. Others were bayoneted repeatedly. Japanese officers practiced their sword techniques, beheading prisoners with ceremonial samurai blades. The killing lasted hours. The Pantingan River red. 2 men survived. Lieutenant Manuel Yan and Captain Ricardo Papa managed to cut their wire bonds and escape during the confusion. Yan would later become Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. Papa would serve as Chief of the Manila Police. Both spent the rest of their lives testifying about the massacre they witnessed, ensuring the names of the 350 dead would not be forgotten. The route from Mariveles climbed north along the East Coast Road. Prisoners from Bagak marched east across the peninsula to join the main column at Pilar. The terrain varied from paved highway to dirt road to paths barely wide enough for the column. Rice paddies stretched on either side in some areas. In others, jungle pressed close to the road. Villages appeared occasionally, silent populations watching the endless stream of defeated soldiers stumble past. Filipino civilians tried to help despite Japanese threats. Women and children lined the road offering food, water, coconuts, sugarcane, whatever they had. The Japanese guards kicked them away, beat them with rifle butts, bayoneted those who persisted. Some civilians were shot on the spot as warnings to others. Yet they kept trying, demonstrating a courage and compassion that contrasted sharply with Japanese cruelty. The prisoners learned quickly that any attempt to obtain water or food meant death. Guards dangled canteens in front of prisoners, then poured the water on the ground while laughing. They held rice balls before starving men, then fed them to dogs. The psychological torture accompanied the physical suffering in carefully orchestrated cruelty. By the time the column reached Balanga, the first major collection point, hundreds of bodies lined the road. Survivors stepping over corpses became so common it ceased to register emotionally. The dead lay where they fell, sprawled across the road, dumped in ditches, propped against trees. Some had been dead for hours. Others had died minutes earlier. The living trudged past without looking. The distance from Mariveles to Balanga measured approximately 18 miles. In normal conditions, a healthy soldier could cover that distance in 5 to 6 hours. The prisoners took 2 to 3 days. Stopping unpredictably when guards decided, sitting in the blazing sun for hours before being ordered to move again. At night, they were herded into enclosures, barbed wire pens or old warehouses, and packed so tightly they couldn't sit. Those who collapsed were trampled. When dysentery struck, men relieved themselves where they stood because leaving the mass of bodies meant a bayonet. Balanga itself had been the site of General King's surrender just days earlier. Now it became a collection point for the march. Thousands of prisoners crowded into an area without sanitation, without water, without food. The Japanese guards stood watch, but provided nothing. Men drank from stagnant puddles thick with scum. They ate grass. They lay in the mud, too weak to stand. Colonel Ben Scarden remembered reaching Balanga. We were just exhausted. I mean, totally exhausted. I weighed about 110 pounds. I had been 165. I had beriberi so bad, my feet were so sensitive, nothing could touch them without me jerking. My buddies Henry Leitner and Otis Morgan had to help me walk. The first segment of the march, Mariveles to Balanga, had killed hundreds. The Japanese had established the pattern that would continue for the next 50 miles. No food, no water, no rest except when guards decided. Anyone who fell would be killed. The sun and the bayonets worked together, culling the weak with mechanical efficiency. And the march had only just begun. The Japanese employed a torture technique survivors called the sun treatment or Oriental sun treatment. The method demonstrated calculated cruelty rather than random violence. During the march, guards would call halts at specific locations, always in open fields with no shade. Prisoners were ordered into these fields and commanded to sit. Then they would wait. The tropical sun in April hammered down with temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the open. No head coverings were permitted. Guards ripped off any hats or helmets. No shade was allowed. Guards positioned themselves under any available trees while forcing prisoners to sit fully exposed. And critically, no water was provided. Men sat with empty canteens strapped to their belts, dying of thirst with water sources sometimes visible in the distance. Henry Wileto documented the pattern. They always marched you early in the morning, sat you down about 11 a.m., and you'd stay in the field until 4 in the afternoon in the hot sun, 110 to 115 degrees, while the guards were in the shade. The timing was deliberate. 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. captured the sun at its most brutal. Anyone who moved faced immediate violence. Anyone who asked for water was shot. Guards walked through the sitting prisoners looking for violations. A head not bowed low enough, eyes that met Japanese eyes, any sign of defiance. The beatings and bayonettings continued even during these rest periods. The sensory experience of the sun treatment bordered on hallucinatory. The heat rose in visible waves from the baked earth. Men felt their skin burning, their brains cooking inside their skulls. Tongues swelled until they filled mouths. Lips cracked and bled. Eyes dried out, making it painful to blink. The smell of unwashed bodies, open sores, dysentery, and death became overwhelming in the still air. Some men urinated where they sat because standing meant death. Others had no urine left to pass. Their kidneys had begun shutting down from dehydration. Malaria attacks struck during these periods of forced sitting. The disease operates in cycles, periods of normalcy followed by sudden onset of symptoms. When a malaria attack hit, prisoners would begin shaking uncontrollably with chills despite the overwhelming heat. Then fever would spike to 104 or 105 degrees. The combination of tropical heat and malarial fever killed quickly. Guards showed no sympathy. If a man experiencing a malaria attack couldn't stand when ordered to move, a bayonet or bullet ended his suffering. Lester Tenney described watching men die during the sun treatment. You could see them going. Their eyes would glaze over. They'd start talking nonsense, calling for their mothers, their wives, their children. Then they'd just slump over, dead from dehydration and heat. The guards wouldn't let us move the bodies. We'd sit there with dead men slumped against us until the guards decided we could move. The march route from Balanga continued north through Orani to Dinalupahan. This segment stretched approximately 25 miles through mixed terrain. The road alternated between paved sections and dirt paths. Villages appeared every few miles, silent witnesses to the river of defeated humanity flowing past. The Filipino population watched with horror and grief. These were their countrymen, their family members, their defenders who had fought to protect them from Japanese occupation. Some prisoners died from causes having nothing to do with Japanese cruelty. 3 months of malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and starvation had weakened bodies to the point where death needed no external cause. Hearts simply stopped. Kidneys failed. Infections that healthy bodies would have fought off became lethal. Men died while walking, falling forward mid-stride to lie unmoving in the road. But most deaths resulted from deliberate Japanese actions. The pattern became grimly predictable. A prisoner would fall. Guards would kick him and shout, "Speedo." If he couldn't rise within seconds, a bayonet thrust or rifle shot would follow. The column would march around or over the body. No one stopped. No one was allowed to help. The wounded and sick learned quickly, keep moving or die. Colonel Ben Scarden witnessed bodies that had been run over so many times by trucks they resembled paper cutouts. There were 2 in the middle of the road, Americans, and they had been run over so many times that they were flattened out. You know how you cut out a silhouette of somebody. It looked like they were cardboard. You could pick them up. Japanese truck drivers made no effort to avoid bodies. Some accelerated when approaching a corpse, turning the remains into unrecognizable pulp. The killing took many forms. Bayoneting was most common because it required no ammunition. Guards would approach a fallen prisoner, drive the bayonet through his back or stomach, twist it to maximize damage, then withdraw it and move on. The victim might die immediately or might take minutes, bleeding out in agony while the column marched past. Shooting was reserved for prisoners who committed specific offenses: trying to escape, being found with contraband, talking back to guards, or simply being in the wrong place when a guard felt like killing someone. The crack of rifle fire punctuated the march constantly. No one turned to look anymore. Another death barely registered. The killing took many forms. Bayoneting was most common because it required no ammunition. Guards would approach a fallen prisoner, drive the bayonet through his back or stomach, twist it to maximize damage, then withdraw it and move on. The victim might die immediately or might take minutes, bleeding out in agony while the column marched past. Shooting was reserved for prisoners who committed specific offenses: trying to escape, being found with contraband, talking back to guards, or simply being in the wrong place when a guard felt like killing someone. The crack of rifle fire punctuated the march constantly. No one turned to look anymore. Another death barely registered. Beheading occurred less frequently, but made a strong impression on survivors. Japanese officers practiced traditional sword techniques on prisoners. A quick beheading required skill. The swordsman must strike at precisely the right angle, with sufficient force to sever the spine in one cut. Imperfect technique meant multiple blows, creating a spectacle that guards used to terrorize other prisoners into compliance. Some prisoners were used for bayonet practice. Guards would tie a man to a tree or post, then form a line. Each guard would take a turn thrusting his bayonet into the prisoner. The victim's screams gradually weakened to moans, then silence. The exercise served multiple purposes. It let guards practice their technique, it intimidated other prisoners, and it satisfied sadistic impulses. Filipino civilians caught providing food or water to prisoners faced similar fates. Japanese guards bayoneted old women who offered coconuts. They shot children trying to give prisoners sugarcane. They beat civilians who approached the column with any supplies.
The message was clear: helping prisoners would result in death. Yet Filipinos kept trying, demonstrating a courage and humanity that survivors never forgot. Some prisoners died from causes that seem almost arbitrary in retrospect. Guards killed men for wearing eyeglasses. The Japanese associated glasses with education and intellectualism. They killed men who were too tall. Height suggested better nutrition and therefore officer status. They killed men with wedding rings because the rings could be stolen. They killed men with gold fillings in their teeth, knocking out the teeth and extracting the gold before leaving the body. The randomness of death created psychological terror as effective as the physical violence. A prisoner might survive 3 days of brutal marching, only to be bayoneted because a guard felt insulted by the way the prisoner looked at him. Another might be shot for stumbling too close to a guard. The impossibility of predicting what would trigger violence meant constant fear permeated every moment.
The prisoners developed survival strategies within the narrow confines allowed. Never make eye contact with guards. Move with the crowd, never at the front or back of your group where you're more visible. If you must fall, try to fall when guards aren't looking directly at you. Share any food or water obtained with those around you because you'll need them to share when you have nothing. Help carry sick comrades as long as possible because someone might help carry you. Set small goals. Make it to that tree, that bend in the road, that village, because thinking about the full distance invites despair. Lester Tenney described his mental survival technique. Whatever I did with a philosophy that I had to get to that herd of caribou visible in the distance. Upon reaching it, he would identify a new goal, a tree, a building, anything. I kept setting these little goals, and I made it. Others describe similar approaches. The human mind could not contemplate surviving 65 miles of hell, but it could focus on reaching the next landmark. The march through this middle section, Balanga to Dinalupion, claimed thousands of lives. The exact number remains unknown because no one was counting. Japanese records are incomplete and contradictory. American records document deaths only when witnesses later testified. Filipino casualties went largely unrecorded. Estimates suggest 5,000 to 10,000 men died along this segment alone. Night brought no relief. Prisoners marched until guards decided to stop, usually well after dark. They would be herded into enclosures, sometimes old warehouses, sometimes barbed wire pens, sometimes just designated areas of ground. No sanitation facilities existed. No water was provided. No food appeared. Prisoners collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to arrange themselves in any organized fashion. The crowding in these night enclosures killed men through suffocation and trampling. Packed so tightly they couldn't move, those in the center slowly suffocated from lack of air. Those who collapsed were stepped on by others too weak to stay standing. Men with dysentery relieved themselves on those around them because there was nowhere else to go. The smell became indescribable. A mixture of feces, urine, vomit, infected wounds, and death that survivors remembered decades later with visceral horror. Just as prisoners finally settled, guards would suddenly order them to move again. Sometimes this happened after only an hour or two of rest. The men would stagger to their feet and begin marching in darkness. The psychological torture of interrupted sleep combined with physical exhaustion to push prisoners toward complete mental and physical breakdown. The Japanese had a name for their treatment of prisoners: training to develop patience and endurance. Officers used this phrase in reports, suggesting they viewed the march as a form of military discipline rather than the war crime it manifestly was. This rationalization would later prove critical at war crimes trials when prosecutors established that Japanese commanders knew about and sanctioned the brutality rather than viewing it as unauthorized violence by individual guards.
By the time prisoners reached Dinalupihan, marking the boundary of Bataan province, approximately half the march distance had been covered. But more than half of the deaths remained ahead. The next segment, from Dinalupihan to San Fernando, would prove the deadliest yet. And after San Fernando, the hellish boxcar journey and Camp O'Donnell awaited.
The segment from Dinalupihan to San Fernando Pampanga measured approximately 20 miles. These final miles of the foot march claimed disproportionate casualties because prisoners reached their absolute physical limits. Men who had somehow survived 4 or 5 days of marching without food or water simply had nothing left. Bodies began shutting down systemically. Kidneys failed, hearts gave out, brains, deprived of glucose and oxygen, stopped functioning properly. The hallucinations began in earnest during this segment. Prisoners reported seeing water that wasn't there, shimmering mirages in the heat-distorted air. Some saw their family standing by the roadside, calling to them. Others heard voices of dead comrades urging them forward or telling them to give up. The line between reality and delusion blurred. Guards learned to recognize the glassy-eyed stare of men no longer mentally present. These prisoners received bayonets almost as a mercy. They were already gone in every way that mattered. Irwin Johnson, serving with a support unit, described the landscape of death. When they first started the march, they had to go up a hill. There were Filipino bodies that had been rolled over by Japanese trucks so many times they could hardly tell it was a human body. The accumulation of corpses created grotesque landmarks. Prisoners navigated by death. Turn left at the 3 bodies under the acacia tree. Continue past the pile of corpses near the burned-out truck. The town of Dinalupihan itself marked a symbolic boundary. A memorial stands there now, the first line of defense memorial, though in April 1942 it was just another checkpoint where Japanese guards changed shifts and fresh brutality awaited. The prisoners who passed through Dinalupihan had generally been marching for 5 to 7 days. Their feet were masses of blisters and infected wounds. Their leg muscles had long since depleted all glycogen and were consuming themselves for fuel. Each step became an act of will overriding the body's desperate signals to stop. Some men developed beriberi during the march itself, their vitamin B-deficient bodies finally succumbing completely. Beriberi causes nerve damage and swelling. Feet become so sensitive that the slightest touch causes excruciating pain. Colonel Ben Scardon experienced this. My feet, nothing could touch them without me jerking. I mean, it was terrible. Walking becomes torture, yet stopping meant death. So men with beriberi shuffled forward on feet that felt like they were burning from the inside, each step agony. The psychological toll became as devastating as the physical suffering. Lester Tenney described the emotional landscape. You get to the point when you see this happening, you don't want to make good friends because you don't want to lose them. Those who wanted to die, died. You couldn't stop them. Many prisoners prayed to die in the first 30 days. Survivors prayed to live. The distinction Tenney drew revealed a profound truth. At a certain point, survival became primarily a mental decision. Bodies had degraded beyond the point where physical conditioning mattered. Everyone was starving, dehydrated, diseased, and wounded. The difference between those who lived and those who died often came down to whether they retained the will to take the next step despite everything screaming at them to stop. Acts of compassion occurred even in this hellscape. Stronger prisoners supported weaker ones, literally carrying them when possible. Groups formed ad hoc, 3 or 4 men who decided to survive together, taking turns supporting whoever was weakest at any given moment. These informal partnerships saved lives. A man might not find the strength to continue for himself, but he might find it to help a friend, and that friend might later return the favor. When roles reversed, Colonel Scardon survived because of exactly such help. His friends Henry Leitner and Otis Morgan essentially carried him the final miles to San Fernando.
When Skardon could no longer walk due to bravery, they held him upright between them, his feet barely touching the ground, and moved him forward. Later, when they reached camp and Skardon lay near death, Leitner and Morgan traded Skardon's Clemson class ring to a guard for a chicken. They made broth from that chicken and fed it to Skardon over several days. "It saved my life," Skardon stated decades later. "When I tell you something saved my life, it saved my life." Not everyone received such help. The Japanese forbade helping fallen comrades. Any prisoner who stopped to assist another risked being bayoneted alongside them. Guards enforced this rule ruthlessly. Survival often meant stepping over friends and continuing alone. The guilt from these choices haunted survivors for decades. Tenney admitted, "I feel guilty many times, even today. I feel guilty that I'm back. I feel guilty that I'm living such a wonderful life. I feel guilty that a lot of my friends didn't come back." Filipino civilians continued their attempts to help despite mounting casualties among themselves. In one documented incident, a woman rushed from her home carrying a jug of water. She reached the column and began pouring water into prisoners' cupped hands. A guard approached and drove his bayonet through her stomach. She fell with the water jug shattering on the road. No one was allowed to help her. She died within minutes while the column marched past. Similar scenes occurred hundreds of times. The Filipino people's courage in the face of such consequences demonstrated a heroism equal to any military action. The approach to San Fernando brought a new horror: the smell. The town held thousands of prisoners already arrived, crowded into open pens without sanitation. The stench of dysentery, infected wounds, and death carried on the wind for miles. Prisoners approaching the town knew what awaited by the smell alone. San Fernando represented not rest or relief, but merely a transition to the next phase of suffering, the boxcar journey to Capas. San Fernando, Pampanga is a prosperous provincial capital today. In April 1942, it became a collection point for hell. Japanese guards herded prisoners into open areas near the railroad station. No food was provided. Water came from a single well that couldn't possibly serve thousands of men. Fights broke out over access to that well. Guards let prisoners fight each other, even encouraged it, finding entertainment in watching desperate men attack each other over a drink of water. The town's Filipino population could see the prisoners from their homes and businesses. Some wept openly at the sight of their defenders reduced to such misery. Others turned away, unable to bear witnessing the suffering. A few brave souls still attempted to provide food or water, knowing the likely consequences. More civilians died in San Fernando at Japanese hands for the crime of compassion. Prisoners who reached San Fernando alive had survived approximately 65 miles of marching without adequate food or water under a tropical sun, while suffering from malaria, dysentery, and various wounds. Simply reaching this point represented a physical and mental achievement that defies easy description. They had walked when their bodies insisted they could not. They had continued when their minds demanded they stopped. They had watched friends die and kept moving. They had experienced casual brutality of a scope and intensity that would leave psychological scars for life. The exact death toll for the March segment remains disputed. Conservative estimates suggest 500 to 650 Americans died between Mariveles and San Fernando. Filipino casualties ranged from 5,000 to 10,000. The wide range reflects the chaos. The exact death toll for the March segment remains disputed. Conservative estimates suggest 500 to 650 Americans died between Mariveles and San Fernando. Filipino casualties ranged from 5,000 to 10,000. The wide range reflects the chaos and lack of record-keeping. Japanese guards didn't count the dead. They simply bayoneted anyone who fell and moved on.
American and Filipino witnesses could document only what they personally saw. The true number will never be known with certainty. But numbers, however important for historical record, fail to capture the individual tragedies. Each death represented a life, a man with a family, with dreams, with a history. Young men died without ever experiencing life beyond military service. Married men died without seeing their wives or children again. Old soldiers who had served for decades died in a manner that dishonored their years of service. Every corpse on that road had been someone's son, someone's friend, someone's hope for the future. The survivors reaching San Fernando bore psychological scars that would never fully heal. Many never spoke of their experiences for decades. Colonel Scardon didn't discuss the march until he was 80 years old. I felt humiliated. We had surrendered. We gave up. The shame of surrender, compounded by the trauma of the march, created a burden survivors carried in silence. Yet they had survived. Through some combination of luck, willpower, physical resilience, and the help of comrades, they had reached San Fernando alive. But their ordeal was far from over. The boxcars waited at the railroad station. And beyond that, Camp O'Donnell represented a slow death as cruel as the quick death of the march. Those who survived the march would now face months or years of captivity under conditions that would kill nearly half of them. The sun set on another day of death on April 1942. In San Fernando, thousands of prisoners lay on the ground, too weak to move, too traumatized to speak, too exhausted to even sleep properly. Japanese guards stood watch, rifles ready, bayonets fixed. Tomorrow, the boxcars would be loaded. The journey would continue. The dying would not stop.
The prisoners who reached San Fernando alive discovered their journey was not over. World War I-era metal boxcars sat on the tracks at the railroad station. These freight cars, designed to transport cargo or perhaps 30 people in humane conditions, would each hold over 100 emaciated, disease-ridden prisoners for an hour-long journey to Capas in unventilated conditions reaching 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Staff Sergeant Alf Larson described the loading. So tight you couldn't sit down. If you passed out, you couldn't fall down. Japanese guards used rifle butts to pack prisoners into each boxcar, shoving and beating men until physically no more bodies could fit. The doors slid shut with a metallic clang that survivors remembered decades later. Darkness, crushing pressure from all sides. The rising temperature turning the metal cars into ovens. The journey to Capas measured only about 25 miles by rail. Under normal circumstances, a pleasant hour-long trip. In the boxcars, it became another chapter in the catalog of horrors. Men suffocated in the center of the crush of bodies. Others died from heat stroke as temperatures inside the cars exceeded anything human bodies could withstand for long. Those with dysentery couldn't control their bowels. The floor became slick with feces, urine, vomit, and blood. The smell defied description. Some men died standing up, held upright by the press of bodies around them. When the doors finally opened at Capas, they tumbled out with the living, only their glassy eyes and stillness revealing death. Guards kicked the corpses aside and ordered the survivors to march. 7 to 9 more miles remained, the final march from Capas to Camp O'Donnell. This last segment killed men who had survived everything else. After 65 miles of marching, the sun treatment, the beatings, the starvation, and the boxcar journey, these final miles broke men who had seemed unbreakable. They had survived too much for too long. Bodies simply gave out. Hearts stopped. Men sat down by the roadside and never stood again. Guards bayoneted some of these. Others were simply left to die slowly in the tropical heat. Camp O'Donnell appeared in the distance. 617 acres of treeless rice paddy and grassland surrounded by rusty barbed wire and guard towers. Barracks consisted of nipa palm and thatch roofs over bamboo pole skeletons with dirt floors. No windows, no walls, no beds. Just platforms of split bamboo where prisoners would sleep side by side, unable to turn over without coordinating with neighbors. Captain John E. Olson, who became the camp's leading chronicler, called it the Andersonville of the Pacific, comparing it to the notorious Confederate prison camp of the Civil War. The comparison proved apt. Both camps featured inadequate food, contaminated water, rampant disease, and death rates that shocked even hardened soldiers. The Japanese had prepared Camp O'Donnell for perhaps 10,000 prisoners. They received over 70,000. Every calculation, every assumption, every plan collapsed under the weight of numbers. There was nowhere near anything: food, water, medicine, shelter, or space. Water became the most critical shortage. The camp had a polluted crete and a few low-yield spigots. Lines to fill a single canteen stretched for hours. Men waited all day in the blazing sun just to obtain enough water to survive until the next day's wait. Some passed out or died while standing in line. Others gave up and drank from stagnant puddles or the polluted creek, guaranteeing dysentery and worse. Camp Commandant Captain Yoshio Tsuneyoshi greeted arriving prisoners with a speech that revealed Japanese attitudes. "You are cowards and should have committed suicide as any Japanese soldier would do when facing capture. It is only due to the generosity of the Japanese that you are alive. I have already shot many Filipinos in the last week for disobedience of orders."
The speech was not hyperbole. Tsuneyoshi had indeed ordered executions for minor infractions. His guards followed his lead. Prisoners who failed to bow properly to Japanese guards were beaten or shot. Those who complained about conditions were punished. Anyone suspected of planning escape was tortured and executed. The arbitrary nature of punishment created an atmosphere of constant fear. The death rate at Camp O'Donnell reached genocidal levels. Filipino prisoners died at rates exceeding 400 per day through the camp's first months. American deaths peaked at 40 to 50 per day by late May 1942. The camp hospital earned the nickname Zero Ward because zero was the probability of getting out of it alive. Captain Weinstein, a physician, described the medical situation. If the angel of death ever had a cauldron of victims ready for him, it was in O'Donnell. Doctors had virtually no medicine, no instruments, no bandages, no anesthesia. They could do little beyond comfort dying men. Diseases that were easily treatable killed with impunity. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, dengue fever, diphtheria, and simple infections all claimed lives. Food consisted of rice and vegetable soup, approximately 1,500 calories daily, when prisoners needed 3,000 just to maintain their already depleted body weight. The rice was often full of maggots and weevils. The soup was little more than hot water with a few vegetable scraps floating in it. Occasionally, shreds of water buffalo meat appeared, providing minimal protein. Men continued losing weight. Their bodies consumed themselves. First fat reserves, long since depleted. Then muscle, then organs. Walking skeletons stumbled through the camp, barely recognizable as human. The vitamin deficiencies caused specific horrors. Beriberi resulted from lack of vitamin B1. Wet beriberi caused swelling and fluid accumulation. Dry beriberi destroyed nerves, causing paralysis and excruciating pain. Pellagra from niacin deficiency caused skin lesions, dementia, and death. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C made old wounds reopen and gums turn to bloody pulp. Men lost their teeth. Their hair fell out. Their skin developed ulcers that wouldn't heal. The Japanese refused most offers of assistance. The Philippine Red Cross attempted to provide medicine and food. The Japanese turned them away. International relief organizations tried to send supplies. The Japanese confiscated most of it. The prisoners were effectively cut off from the world, left to die slowly while the war raged on around them. Mass graves became a feature of the camp landscape. Work details of prisoners barely strong enough to walk would drag corpses to pits and drop them in. Often the graves were too shallow. Heavy rains would wash away the thin covering of earth, exposing decomposing bodies. The smell of death permeated everything. Men ate, slept, and lived with the constant presence and smell of death. By the time Camp O'Donnell closed on January 20, 1943, it had killed approximately 1,547 Americans, about 1/6 of the American prisoners who entered. Filipino deaths ranged from 20,000 to 26,000. Combined with March deaths, total American and Filipino casualties exceeded 25,000 by June 1942 alone. More would die in subsequent camps over the next 3 years. American prisoners began transferring to Cabanatuan POW camp in June 1942. Located 9 kilometers east of Cabanatuan City, it became the largest POW camp in the Philippines with up to 10,000 prisoners. Conditions there were marginally better than O'Donnell, but marginally better still meant hundreds died. July 1942 was the deadliest month, with 799 deaths. By the camp's liberation on January 30, 1945, over 2,700 POWs lay buried in its cemetery.
Filipino prisoners were largely released in July 1942 with conditional pardons after signing agreements not to join guerrilla forces. Many signed the papers and then joined the resistance anyway. They had seen too much brutality, lost too many comrades, suffered too much themselves to remain passive. The Filipino resistance became one of the most effective guerrilla movements of World War II, providing crucial intelligence to Allied forces throughout the occupation. Some American prisoners were eventually transported to Japan, Korea, Manchuria, and other locations throughout the Japanese Empire as slave labor. These men traveled on unmarked freighters called hell ships, vessels that American forces sometimes unknowingly attacked. When hell ships sank, prisoners locked in holds drowned by the hundreds. Over the course of the war, 26 such ships were sunk, with approximately 10,000 POWs lost. The survivors of Camp O'Donnell carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Lester Tenney developed post-traumatic stress very seriously. He couldn't speak about his experiences for decades. When he finally wrote about them in his book My Hitch in Hell, the process of remembering proved almost as traumatic as the original events. Colonel Ben Scarden explained his silence. "I never spoke about it until I was 80 years old. I felt humiliated. We had surrendered. We gave up." The shame of surrender compounded the trauma of captivity, creating a double burden survivors bore alone. American society celebrated World War II veterans, but many Bataan survivors felt they didn't deserve celebration. They had surrendered. They had been prisoners. In their minds, that diminished their service, despite the fact they had fought longer and suffered more than most combat veterans. The psychological toll manifested in various ways. Some survivors developed alcoholism. Others experienced depression and anxiety. Many had nightmares for decades. Some became hypervigilant, unable to relax even in safe environments.
The diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist during their lifetimes. It was developed decades later, largely based on studying Vietnam veterans. But Bataan survivors exhibited every symptom that would later define PTSD. Survivors' guilt proved particularly corrosive. Tenney expressed it clearly. "I feel guilty many times, even today. I feel guilty that I'm back. I feel guilty that I'm living such a wonderful life. I feel guilty that a lot of my friends didn't come back. Why did I survive when so many died? What did I do differently? Did I fail to help someone who could have been saved?" These questions haunted survivors with no good answers available. Yet some survivors eventually found peace. Colonel Scarden became an English professor at Clemson University and lived to age 103. He participated in the Bataan Memorial Death March, a commemorative event held annually at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, 11 times, walking 8.5 miles at age 100. His presence served as a living reminder of what human beings can endure and overcome. Lester Tenney wrote 2 books about his experiences and became an advocate for POW recognition. In 2010, he traveled to Japan and received a formal apology from Japanese officials. "It took 65 years," he said, "but I finally got my apology." He died in 2017 at age 96, having spent his final decades ensuring the world would remember the Bataan Death March. The survivors who lived long enough to tell their stories became invaluable witnesses to history. Each testimony added detail to the historical record. Each survivor's account confirmed and expanded on others. Together, they created a comprehensive picture of one of World War II's worst atrocities. Their courage in eventually speaking about their trauma ensured that the 25,000 who died would not be forgotten. The world learned about the Bataan Death March slowly and incompletely. In April 1943, 10 Americans and 2 Filipinos escaped from Davao prison camp on Mindanao. Lieutenant Commander Melvin McCoy, Major Stephen Melnick, and Captain William E. Dice reached Australia carrying the first eyewitness accounts for General MacArthur's headquarters. What they reported shocked even hardened military officers who thought they had seen everything war could offer. But the United States government imposed a gag order. The escapees were forbidden from speaking publicly about what they had witnessed. The government feared the revelations would provoke Japanese retaliation against remaining POWs. They also calculated that timing the release of information could maximize its propaganda impact. The silence held until January 27-28, 1944, nearly 2 years after the march. The government coordinated the release with a major war bond drive. Life magazine published "Death Was a Part of Our Life" on February 7, 1944, with Captain Dice's first-hand account. The article sparked outrage not seen since Pearl Harbor. Americans had grown accustomed to war news, to casualty reports, to battles won and lost. But the systematic brutality described by Dice struck a nerve. War bond sales nearly doubled in the weeks following publication. President Franklin Roosevelt vowed those responsible would face justice. General George Marshall declared, "These brutal reprisals upon helpless victims evidence the shallow advance from savagery which the Japanese people have made." The Bataan Death March became a rallying cry. "Remember Bataan" appeared on recruiting posters alongside "Remember Pearl Harbor." The march's revelation also influenced public support for using atomic weapons against Japan. When President Harry Truman authorized dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, public opinion overwhelmingly supported the decision. The memory of Bataan and other Japanese atrocities created an atmosphere where ending the war quickly by any means seemed justified.
Whether this constituted rational policy or revenge-driven decision-making remains debated by historians, but the emotional impact of stories like the Death March cannot be disputed. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. American forces liberated POW camps throughout the Japanese Empire. The survivors emerged as living skeletons, many weighing less than 100 pounds despite being 6 feet tall. Medical officers documented their conditions with photographs that shocked the world. These were not strangers in a distant land. These were American and Filipino soldiers, Allied prisoners, men who deserved humane treatment under international law. The hunt for those responsible began immediately. General Douglas MacArthur, now Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, established military tribunals to prosecute Japanese war criminals. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa had returned to Japan after capturing the Philippines. He retired from active command and lived quietly on his farm. On September 26, 1945, American military police arrested him. He was transported to Manila to face charges for war crimes committed by forces under his command. The trial began on January 3 at the High Commissioner's residence in Manila. 5 generals presided, 4 American and 1 Filipino. Major General Basilio J. Valdez represented the Philippines. His presence carried particular weight. His own brother had been murdered by Japanese forces during the occupation.
Homa faced 48 counts of violating international rules of war. The charges centered on his failure to control the operations of the members of his command, permitting them to commit brutal atrocities and other high crimes. This represented a novel legal theory, command responsibility. Prosecutors argued that a commander bore legal responsibility for war crimes committed by subordinates even without direct orders, if the commander knew or should have known about the crimes and failed to prevent or punish them. The 27-year-old Chief Defense Counsel, Major John H. Skeen, Jr., had never tried a criminal case before. He was assigned the defense just weeks before trial, giving him minimal time to prepare. The trial itself proceeded with remarkable speed, 5 weeks from start to verdict. Defense attorneys argued this rush schedule denied Homa adequate representation. The defense strategy centered on portraying Homa as an out-of-touch commander who had delegated authority and learned about atrocities only after the war. Witnesses testified that Homa spent most of April 1942 planning the assault on Corregidor Fortress, paying little attention to prisoner transfer operations. He had assigned those responsibilities to subordinates, as any general would. How could he be held responsible for actions of individual guards he never met? The prosecution demolished this defense systematically. They proved atrocities were so widespread and so broad in pattern and design and so continuous that Homa had to have known. His headquarters sat at Balanga, just 500 yards from the march route. Thousands of prisoners passed directly by his command post. The screams, the gunshots, the bodies visible from his headquarters made ignorance impossible to credit. Furthermore, prosecution witnesses established that Homa's staff officers had inspected the march route and reported conditions to headquarters. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji had issued orders to execute American prisoners, orders that originated from Homa's staff even if not from Homa personally. Several Japanese officers testified they had informed Homa about prisoner mistreatment. He had done nothing to stop it. The trial featured wrenching testimony from survivors. Lester Tenney, Colonel Ben Scarden, and dozens of others took the stand to describe what they had endured. Their accounts, delivered with the authority of eyewitnesses, left no doubt about the systematic nature of the atrocities. This was not random violence by a few bad actors. This was organized brutality enabled and permitted by the command structure. Filipino witnesses testified about civilian deaths, the women and children bayoneted for offering food to prisoners. The men executed for helping Americans escape. The villages burned in retaliation for harboring guerrillas. The scope of suffering extended far beyond military prisoners to encompass the entire Filipino people. On February 11, 1946, the tribunal announced its verdict: guilty on all counts. Homa showed no emotion. He maintained that he had commanded honorably, that he bore no responsibility for actions he never ordered or endorsed. The tribunal rejected these claims. General MacArthur affirmed the conviction on March 21, stating, "If this defendant does not deserve his judicial fate, none in jurisdictional history ever did." Homa was sentenced to death by firing squad. His wife petitioned President Truman for clemency. American veterans organizations lobbied for the sentence to be carried out. The Supreme Court of the United States reviewed the case. Justices Frank Murphy and Wiley Rutledge dissented, calling the trial a miscarriage of justice and warning that the proceedings resembled blood purges more than legitimate trials. They argued the rush trial, inexperienced defense counsel, and command responsibility doctrine set dangerous precedents.
Their dissent was noted but changed nothing. At 1 a.m. on April 3, 1946, Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa faced a firing squad at Los Baños, south of Manila. 12 soldiers stood 15 paces away. Homa refused a blindfold. He remained calm and stoical, declining to make a final statement. A black hood covered his head. A 4-inch round target marked his heart. The command was given. 12 rifles fired as one. Homa died instantly. Other Japanese officers faced similar fates. Major General Yoshitaka Kawane and Colonel Kuretaro Hirano, charged with ordering the death march and deaths of 10,000 prisoners, were hanged at Sugamo Prison on June 12, 1949. Captain Yoshio Tsuneyoshi, Camp O'Donnell's brutal commandant, was convicted in 1947 and sentenced to death. His sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Then he received a pardon from Philippine President Elpidio Quirino on July 4, 1953. But the most culpable escaped justice entirely. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who had issued clandestine orders to execute American prisoners and orchestrated atrocities including the Pantingan River Massacre, fled to China at war's end. He evaded capture despite extensive searches. He lived in exile for years, eventually returning to Japan in 1949 after the occupation ended. He was never tried for his crimes. He later served in the Japanese Diet and died in 1961, having faced no consequences for his role in mass murder. The Bataan Death March trials established important legal precedents that persist today. The command responsibility doctrine became a cornerstone of international humanitarian law. Commanders cannot claim ignorance of subordinate actions. They have an affirmative duty to prevent war crimes and punish those who commit them. Failure to do so makes them criminally liable. This doctrine influenced the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which strengthened protections for prisoners of war and civilians in wartime. It shaped the statutes of modern international criminal tribunals, including those for the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and the International Criminal Court. The principle that following orders does not excuse war crimes and that giving orders creates criminal liability traces directly to cases like Homa's trial. The trials also sparked controversy that continues among legal scholars. Defense counsel John Skeen later wrote that Homa's trial was highly irregular, conducted in an atmosphere that left no doubt as to what the ultimate outcome would be. Historian D. Clayton James called it a miscarriage of justice, driven more by vengeance than legal principle. These critics argue that the rushed proceedings, command responsibility doctrine applied retroactively, and emotional atmosphere created show trials rather than fair adjudications. Supporters counter that the evidence was overwhelming, the legal principles sound, and justice necessary. Tens of thousands died due to conditions Homa could have prevented with a single order. His failure to act when he had both authority and knowledge made him culpable. The speed of the trial reflected the strength of the evidence, not procedural unfairness. And establishing that commanders bear responsibility for subordinate actions was essential to preventing future atrocities. Whatever one's view of the trial's fairness, they fulfilled MacArthur's promise that those responsible would face consequences. The survivors saw their tormentors held accountable. The dead were vindicated, and future military commanders received clear notice that they would be held responsible for the actions of their troops.
The prisoners at Cabanatuan POW camp had endured nearly 3 years of captivity by January 1945. Of the approximately 8,000 American and Allied prisoners who had passed through the camp, only 516 remained alive. The Japanese had transported most to Japan and other locations as slave labor. Those left behind were the sickest, weakest, least useful for forced labor. They expected to die at Cabanatuan. But American forces were advancing rapidly across the Philippines. General MacArthur had kept his promise to return, landing at Leyte in October 1944. By January 1945, American forces approached Cabanatuan. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese might massacre remaining prisoners rather than allow their liberation. The Palawan Massacre of December 14, 1944, when Japanese forces burned alive approximately 150 POWs, had demonstrated this threat was real. On January 30, 1945, the U.S. Army 6th Ranger Battalion, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas under Captain Eduardo Joson and Major Juan Pajota launched a daring raid. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci commanded the operation, which required infiltrating 30 miles behind Japanese lines to reach the camp. The raid succeeded brilliantly. American Rangers and Filipino guerrillas overwhelmed the Japanese guards, killing at least 530 enemy soldiers while suffering minimal casualties. 2 POWs died, one from illness during the evacuation, one from a heart attack, and 26 men were wounded. The 516 surviving prisoners were freed. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger observed the liberated men and recorded his impressions. Most of them were in pitiable condition and could not realize they were actually safe. 3 years of captivity had destroyed their ability to believe in rescue. Many couldn't walk. Rangers and guerrillas carried them on improvised stretchers. The journey back to American lines took hours, with constant fear of Japanese counterattack. When the freed prisoners finally reached safety, medical officers documented their conditions with photographs that shocked the world. Men weighing 80 pounds, tropical ulcers that had eaten through to bone, malaria so chronic it would recur for the rest of their lives, beriberi-induced nerve damage causing permanent disability, psychological trauma that would manifest in nightmares and flashbacks for decades. The Cabanatuan raid represented one of the war's most successful prisoner rescues, but it came tragically late for most. Of approximately 22,000 Americans captured in the Philippines, only about 15,000 returned to the United States. The death rate exceeded 40.4% for American POWs held by Japan, compared to just 1.2% for those held by Nazi Germany. 2 out of every 3 soldiers taken captive on Bataan perished. The war ended with Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. Survivors began returning home over subsequent months. They arrived to a nation celebrating victory, but unprepared to understand what these particular veterans had endured. The public wanted heroic war stories. The Bataan survivors had only stories of suffering, defeat, and survival through circumstances that inspired more guilt than pride. Many survivors didn't speak about their experiences for decades. The shame of surrender, the trauma of captivity, and the disconnect between their experience and public expectations created a wall of silence. Colonel Ben Scarden kept silent for 60 years. Lester Tenney couldn't discuss it for 50 years. Others never spoke of it at all, taking their stories to the grave. The survivors who did eventually speak became crucial witnesses to history.
Each testimony added details to the historical record. Lester Tenney wrote 2 books, My Hitch in Hell, published in 1995, and My Last Mission in 2015. Colonel Scardon gave hundreds of interviews and participated in the Bataan Memorial Death March commemorative event 11 times, walking 8.5 miles at age 100 in 2017. Recognition came slowly and incompletely. American veterans received benefits and honors, but Filipino veterans faced a unique betrayal. The Rescission Act of 1946 stripped them of promised benefits, determining that their service to the U.S. Armed Forces would not be recognized for purposes of veterans' benefits. Of 66 allied nations that fought alongside the United States in World War II, only the Philippines was singled out for such treatment. For decades, Filipino veterans fought for recognition. They were elderly or dying before achieving even partial justice. The Filipino Veterans Equity Compensation Fund, signed into law in 2009, provided lump sum payments but not full benefits. The Congressional Gold Medal, signed by President Barack Obama on December 14, 2016, and presented on October 25, 2017, acknowledged their service with the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. Physical memorials now mark the sites of suffering. The Kapas National Shrine stands at the former location of Camp O'Donnell. A 70-meter obelisk, unveiled on April 9, 2003, dominates the landscape. The Wall of Heroes displays over 30,000 names of Filipino dead. Walking paths allow visitors to contemplate the suffering that occurred on this ground. Every April 9th, the Philippines observes Araw ng Kagitigan, Day of Valor, as a national holiday commemorating the fall of Bataan and the resistance that followed. In New Mexico, home of the 200th Coast Artillery Regiment that served on Bataan, the Bataan Memorial Death March has been held annually at White Sands Missile Range since 1989. Over 5,000 participants walked 26.2 miles through desert terrain in tribute to those who survived and those who died. Active-duty military, veterans, and civilians carry weighted rucksacks, experiencing a fraction of what the original marchers endured. The event raises money for scholarships and keeps the memory alive. The survivors attended these memorials when they could. Valdemar de Herrera participated at age 104 in 2024. Their presence provided a living connection to history, a reminder that the march was not ancient history, but within living memory. Each year, fewer survivors attend. Soon, none will remain. The responsibility for remembering will fall entirely to subsequent generations. The Bataan Death March influenced American military culture profoundly. The U.S. military's emphasis on never leaving personnel behind traces partly to the shame of having been unable to relieve or rescue the Bataan defenders. The extensive survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training provided to military personnel stems from analyzing POW experiences in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The commitment to recovering remains of fallen soldiers reflects determination that no one will be forgotten or abandoned. The march also shaped international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, drafted in the immediate aftermath of World War II atrocities, strengthened protections for prisoners of war significantly. Specific provisions prohibiting forced marches, requiring adequate food and water, mandating medical care, and forbidding reprisals against prisoners responded directly to violations like those committed during the Bataan Death March. The march also shaped international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, drafted in the immediate aftermath of World War II atrocities, strengthened protections for prisoners of war significantly. Specific provisions prohibiting forced marches, requiring adequate food and water, mandating medical care, and forbidding reprisals against prisoners responded directly to violations like those committed during the Bataan Death March. The command responsibility doctrine established in the Homa trial influenced all subsequent war crimes prosecutions. commanders at Nuremberg faced similar charges. The international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda applied command responsibility principles. The International Court Statute incorporates it. The principle that commanders cannot claim ignorance of subordinate actions, that they have an affirmative duty to prevent and punish war crimes, traces directly to the Bataan trials.
Yet justice remained incomplete. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who bore direct responsibility for ordering executions and orchestrating massacres, never faced trial. Lower-ranking guards who committed individual murders were never identified or prosecuted. The Japanese government never fully acknowledged the scope of atrocities or paid adequate reparations to survivors. Some Japanese officials and historians continue to downplay or deny the death march's severity, creating ongoing diplomatic tensions with the Philippines and straining U.S.-Japan relations despite the alliance between the nations. Lester Tenney fought for decades to receive an apology from Japan. He testified before Congress. He spoke at international conferences. He corresponded with Japanese officials. Finally, in 2010, he traveled to Japan and received a formal apology from Japanese Foreign Minister Katsuya Okada and Ambassador Ichiro Fujisaki. "It took 65 years," Tenney said, "but I finally got my apology." He died in 2017 at age 96, having spent his final decades ensuring the world would remember. The psychological toll on survivors manifested throughout their lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not diagnosed as such until decades later, affected virtually all survivors. Depression, anxiety, alcoholism, relationship difficulties, and survivors' guilt plagued men who had endured the march. Some never recovered psychologically. Others found ways to build meaningful lives despite their trauma. Colonel Scarden became an English professor at Clemson University. He married, raised children, and lived to 103. He described his survival strategy, focusing on the next small goal rather than the overwhelming whole. This approach, breaking impossible challenges into manageable pieces, served him throughout his long life. The survivors who lived longest often spoke of having found purpose in telling their stories. They felt obligation to speak for those who died. They wanted to ensure the suffering meant something, that lessons were learned, that it would never happen again. This sense of purpose, of bearing witness, gave meaning to their survival and helped process their trauma. As of 2024, only a handful of Bataan Death March survivors remain alive. They are centenarians now: Paul Kircham at 104, Valdemar de Herrera at 104, and a few others. Each year brings obituaries of men who survived one of history's worst war crimes only to succumb finally to old age. Their passing marks not just individual deaths, but the end of living memory of these events. The historical record preserves their testimonies. Books, documentaries, archives, and museums maintain the evidence. But something irreplaceable is lost when the last person who experienced an event dies. The emotional power of meeting a survivor, hearing first-hand testimony, seeing the physical and psychological scars, that direct connection to history will soon be gone forever. This makes remembrance more critical, not less. The Bataan Death March demonstrates humanity's capacity for cruelty. It shows what happens when military forces abandon humanitarian principles. It reveals how ordinary soldiers become capable of extraordinary atrocities when leadership permits or encourages such behavior. These lessons remain relevant in any age. The march also demonstrates human resilience. Men endured suffering that should have killed them and somehow survived. They found strength in friendship, in small acts of kindness, in the determination to live one more day. They proved that the human spirit can endure more than seems possible when survival means returning home to loved ones, when giving up means dishonoring those who already died, when keeping going offers the only path forward.
The 25,000 who died on the march and in the camps deserve remembrance. Each was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. They defended democracy against authoritarianism. They fought with courage until starvation and disease rendered them combat ineffective. They surrendered only when no alternatives remained. Their suffering and death were not meaningless if we learn from their sacrifice and honor their memory. The survivors who lived to tell the story carried that burden faithfully. They spoke when silence would have been easier. They testified despite psychological pain. They participated in memorials and educational efforts despite advancing age. They ensured the world would know what happened on the dusty roads of Bataan in April 1942. Now that responsibility passes to us. We who never experienced the march, who cannot truly comprehend such suffering, who live in freedom secured partly by the sacrifice of those who died, we must remember. We must tell these stories to new generations. We must visit the memorials, read the testimonies, honor the survivors and the dead. We must ensure that the Bataan Death March remains in historical consciousness, not as distant tragedy, but as vivid reminder of war's human cost. The march ended 70 miles from where it began, at Camp O'Donnell in Kapas, Tarlac. But its impact echoes across decades. It influenced law, shaped military culture, affected diplomacy, and scarred thousands of lives. The story of those who survived and those who died deserves permanent place in human memory, as testament to both the depths of cruelty and heights of resilience that define our species.